What if a quest for love and companionship turned into a nightmare? Imagine a woman who simply wanted to feel joy and connection again after years of loss. A man enters her life charming, attentive, and seemingly perfect, but behind his warm smile and kind words lay motives that would shatter her world. This is the story of Yelena Hart, a 67-year-old widow from Charleston, South Carolina, who sought companionship and instead fell into a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal. Her story starts with hope, but takes a chilling turn into tragedy. Stay with me as we uncover the twists and turns of a romance that seemed perfect but ended in heartbreak. What began as a love story in Charleston would leave devastating consequences that no one saw coming. In the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, life moves at a graceful pace. Cobblestone streets wind past historic homes with intricate ironwork balconies, and the scent of salt lingers in the warm, humid air. It's a city steeped in charm, where history and tradition blend effortlessly with the dreams of those who call it home. Among them was Yelena Hart, a 67-year-old widow whose quiet life seemed as picturesque as the city itself. Yelena lived in a small but lovingly maintained house on a tree-lined street just outside Charleston's historic district. She had spent her younger years as a skilled seamstress, creating custom wedding gowns for brides who adored her meticulous craftsmanship. Her work brought her joy, but after the death of her husband, Benjamin, 5 years ago, the vibrant spark she once carried began to fade. Benjamin had been her anchor, a kind, steady presence who made life's challenges bearable. His unexpected passing left Yelena adrift, and though she managed to keep herself busy with gardening, painting, and occasional visits to her favorite bakery, the house felt too big and the days too long. Yelena's 2 adult children, Brielle and Caleb, checked in regularly, but their busy lives in other cities meant she spent much of her time alone. Her loneliness, though well hidden from most, was palpable. She longed for companionship, not necessarily another grand romance, but someone to talk to share meals with, and to remind her that she was still seen and valued. Charleston's charm only amplified her isolation. The bustling couples walking hand in hand through Waterfront Park were a constant reminder of what she had lost. This unspoken longing set the stage for the arrival of Gary Tillman. Gary appeared as if out of a storybook. He was polished, confident, and strikingly attentive. A man in his late 30s, he carried himself with an air of sophistication, claiming to be a successful entrepreneur and seasoned traveler who had settled in Charleston for its beauty and culture. His introduction to Yelena seemed almost too perfect, as if fate had finally decided to throw her a lifeline. The two met in the most unassuming of ways, at a local coffee shop where Yelena often went to sketch. Gary struck up a conversation, commenting on her drawing of a magnolia flower. His charm was effortless, his voice smooth and reassuring. He asked thoughtful questions, showing genuine interest in her life, her art, and her late husband. For Yelena, who hadn't experienced such focused attention in years, the interaction felt refreshing. Gary began appearing at the same coffee shop regularly. At first, their exchanges were casual. Friendly smiles, brief chats about the weather or the books they were reading. But soon these conversations grew deeper. Gary spoke of his own lonely divorce, his passion for travel, and his dreams of finding someone who shared his appreciation for life's finer things. He presented himself as a man who had experienced his share of hardships but remained hopeful for a brighter future. Yelena was captivated. His words seemed so genuine, his interest so sincere. For the first time in years, she felt seen. The walls she had carefully built around her heart after Benjamin's death began to lower. What Yelena didn't know was that Gary Tillman wasn't who he claimed to be. Behind his polished exterior and perfectly tailored stories was Nicholas Hayes, a seasoned con artist with a trail of victims stretching across several states. He was a man who thrived on deception, skilled at identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities of others. Charleston, with its affluent retirees and close-knit community, had become Nicholas's latest hunting ground. He had meticulously crafted his new identity, presenting himself as the perfect gentleman. Well-spoken, cultured, and attentive. He chose his targets carefully, looking for those who seemed isolated or eager for companionship. Yelena, with her warm but wistful demeanor, was an ideal mark. As Gary grew closer to Yelena, his true intentions were hidden beneath layers of charm. To her, he was a kindred spirit, someone who understood her loneliness and offered a chance at happiness. To him, she was an opportunity, a woman whose trust and finances he could manipulate to his advantage. What began as an innocent conversation over coffee would soon spiral into something far more sinister. Gary's arrival in Yelena's life marked the beginning of a devastating chapter, one that would unravel in ways she could never have imagined. Gary Tillman had a way with words that left Yelena Hart feeling like she had rediscovered a part of herself she thought was long gone. Their relationship grew quickly, almost effortlessly. It began with charming text messages, thoughtful notes to brighten her mornings and tender goodnights that made her feel cared for. His words were perfectly chosen, always expressing just the right sentiment. Soon, the messages turned into long phone calls. Gary seemed to hang on to every detail Yelena shared about her life, her dreams, and her late husband Benjamin. He was attentive, understanding, and endlessly complimentary. He told Yelena she had a way of making people feel at ease. He admired her strength, praised her talent for painting, and said she had a warmth about her that was rare. For a woman who had spent years in solitude, Gary's attention felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Yelena hadn't felt this alive in years. It wasn't long before Gary started adding thoughtful gestures to his words. He would surprise her with small gifts, an antique sketchbook, a bouquet of lilies, or pastries from her favorite bakery. On days when she felt unsure of herself, he would remind her of her worth. "Yelena," he'd say, "you're the kind of woman who deserves to be cherished." She felt seen, valued, and loved again, and she began to wonder if this was the second chance at happiness she had stopped believing in. But even as their relationship deepened, there were small inconsistencies in Gary's behavior that raised quiet questions. He often spoke about his work as an entrepreneur, but his descriptions were vague. He claimed to manage multiple businesses, but he never provided specifics about what they were or how they operated. Whenever Yelena asked him to explain more, Gary would steer the conversation elsewhere with his usual charm. At first, Yelena didn't dwell on it. She told herself that some people were just private when it came to their professional lives. After all, he was an independent businessman, and maybe his reluctance to share was a sign of his modesty. Still, there were other things that didn't quite add up. Gary always seemed to have free time, despite his claims of running a successful business. He often mentioned trips out of town for important meetings, but when Yelena asked where he was going or with whom, his answers were vague. The most glaring issue, however, was his reluctance to meet her family. Yelena had spoken fondly of her daughter, Brielle, and her son, Caleb, hoping to introduce Gary to them as their relationship became more serious. Gary always seemed enthusiastic about the idea in theory, but found excuses to avoid it in practice. "We'll plan something soon," he'd say. Or, "I want to make the right impression. I just need to wrap up some things first." To Yelena, these delays were mildly frustrating but not alarming. She believed Gary was simply being careful. But to Brielle, who had grown protective of her mother since Benjamin's passing, Gary's behavior was a flashing red flag. Brielle noticed how her mother seemed more guarded about certain aspects of her life, especially when it came to Gary. When Brielle asked about his background or his business ventures, Yelena would deflect, saying, "He's just private, honey. Not everyone wants to share everything right away." Brielle wasn't convinced. To her, Gary's reluctance was more than privacy. It felt like avoidance. Why didn't he want to meet her family? Was he hiding something, or was it all just a misunderstanding? Multiple theories began to form in Brielle's mind. Was Gary simply shy, hesitant to expose himself to the scrutiny of a family that clearly adored Yelena? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath his polished exterior? Yelena, however, was enamored. Gary had swept her off her feet with his charm, his attentiveness, and the promise of a brighter future. She had spent so long feeling invisible that Gary's devotion made her feel alive again. The subtle red flags that others might have noticed were easy for her to overlook. But Brielle wasn't ready to dismiss her concerns. She decided to do a little digging of her own. If Gary truly cared for her mother, Brielle thought, then he wouldn't mind a closer look into his background. What she discovered would send shockwaves through their lives. For now, though, Yelena remained blissfully unaware. She was caught up in the magic of a romance she hadn't dared to hope for. Gary was everything she thought she needed: attentive, kind, and full of compliments. But beneath his charm, a darker truth was beginning to take shape. Was Gary protecting private business dealings, or was there something more sinister behind his reluctance to open up? And why did he seem so determined to avoid her family? These unanswered questions lingered in the air, setting the stage for what would become a heartbreaking revelation. The relationship between Yelena Hart and Gary Tillman seemed like the perfect second chance at love. Yelena's days were brighter, her laughter more frequent, and her family couldn't help but notice the change in her. But while Yelena was basking in the glow of what felt like newfound happiness, her daughter, Brielle, couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was wrong. Brielle, a sharp and protective daughter, had always been close to her mother. She knew Yelena's life inside and out, the little routines that kept her grounded, the quiet sadness she carried after her husband Benjamin passed, and most importantly, her deep trust in people. So when Gary entered the picture, appearing seemingly out of nowhere and sweeping Yelena off her feet, Brielle couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. Something about him felt off. At first, Brielle kept her concerns to herself. She didn't want to dampen her mother's happiness. But as time went on, her suspicions grew. Gary's reluctance to meet the family struck her as strange. His vague explanations about his work didn't sit right. "I manage investments," he would say, but there were never any details. No firm name, no clear projects, nothing tangible. His excuses about being too busy to meet her brother Caleb were equally thin. Brielle's instincts told her there was more to Gary than he was letting on. Brielle decided to dig deeper. She started subtly asking her mother more about Gary's background. Where did he grow up? Where did he go to school? Who were his close friends? But Yelena couldn't provide many answers. "He's just private," Yelena would say with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Not everyone likes talking about themselves." But Brielle wasn't convinced. She began keeping a closer eye on Gary during his visits, noticing small inconsistencies in his stories. One day he mentioned being from Atlanta, but another time he casually claimed to have lived his whole life in Savannah. His stories never quite lined up. Determined to protect her mother, Brielle took matters into her own hands. She searched for information about Gary online but found nothing under the name Gary Tillman. No business records, no social media accounts, nothing to back up the image he presented. It was as though he didn't exist. Then she had an idea. She used a reverse image search on one of the photos Gary had sent Yelena early in their relationship. What she discovered left her stunned. The photo didn't belong to a man named Gary Tillman. It had been pulled from an old social media account belonging to someone entirely unrelated to Gary, or whoever he really was. Her search led her to an unsettling revelation. The man her mother knew as Gary Tillman was actually Nicholas Hayes, a notorious con artist with a trail of victims spanning multiple states. His name popped up in police reports and legal documents. Nicholas had spent years crafting fake identities, targeting older women for their trust and financial stability. He would charm his way into their lives, gain their trust, and then convince them to hand over their money, all under the guise of love and partnership. The more Brielle uncovered, the more horrifying the picture became. Nicholas had been arrested twice before for fraud but had managed to avoid long-term prison sentences by striking deals or slipping through legal loopholes. In every case, his victims described him the same way: charming, attentive, and completely convincing. Brielle realized that her mother wasn't just another one of Nicholas's targets. She was in the middle of his next con. Armed with this information, Brielle decided to confront her mother. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Yelena was deeply invested in her relationship with Gary, or rather, Nicholas, and Brielle worried that her mother might not believe her. But she couldn't stand by and watch her mother be taken advantage of. When Brielle sat Yelena down to share what she'd found, her words were met with disbelief. "Gary? A con artist? That's ridiculous," Yelena said, shaking her head. "You're being overprotective. He loves me, Brielle. You don't know him like I do." Brielle tried to explain. She showed her mother the online evidence, the police reports, the mismatched details. But Yelena refused to see it. Nicholas had done his work well. He had built a wall of trust around Yelena that Brielle's warnings couldn't penetrate. "This is all just a misunderstanding," Yelena insisted. "You're jumping to conclusions." Gary, or Nicholas, had made Yelena believe in a future filled with love and security. She trusted him completely, so much so that even Brielle's evidence couldn't shake her confidence in him. But cracks were beginning to form. Yelena started noticing small things, like how Gary avoided certain questions, or how he changed the subject whenever she mentioned her finances. These cracks, though subtle, were enough to plant the smallest seeds of doubt. But for now, Yelena clung to the hope that the man she had come to care for was genuine, unaware of the heartbreak that lay ahead. It was a warm, quiet evening in Charleston, South Carolina, when Yelena Hart's world began to collapse. The day had been ordinary. She had spent it tending to her garden and preparing a simple dinner while waiting for Gary Tillman to return from yet another of his mysterious business meetings. As the hours passed with no word from him, a sense of unease began to creep in. Gary had always been attentive, quick to respond to her calls and texts, but tonight was different. Yelena decided to check her phone, hoping for a reassuring message. Instead, what she found left her breathless. A cryptic text from Gary that read, "Yelena, I had to leave. Don't try to find me. Move on. It's better this way." Her hands trembled as she read and reread the message. It didn't make sense. Gary had spoken so often about their future together. The trips they would take, the life they would build. How could he leave without any explanation? She tried calling him immediately, but the phone rang once before going straight to voicemail. Her texts went unanswered. Desperate for answers, Yelena logged into her bank account, a habit she had developed after Gary convinced her to withdraw her savings for a promising investment opportunity. The sight on her screen made her stomach drop. Her account, once filled with the careful savings she had built over years of hard work, was empty. Every penny had been drained. Panic set in as she scanned through the transaction history. There were large transfers to unfamiliar accounts and expenditures in places Yelena had never been. Luxury hotels, high-end restaurants, and boutiques. None of it made sense. The man she loved had reassured her that their investment was safe, that they were building a future together. But the evidence before her told a different story. Yelena's daughter, Brielle, arrived later that night to find her mother sitting in the living room, clutching her phone with tears streaming down her face. "He's gone," Yelena whispered, barely able to form the words. "He took everything." Brielle, who had suspected Gary from the beginning, felt a mix of anger and heartbreak. She comforted her mother as best she could before calling the police to report the theft. The Charleston Police Department wasted no time opening an investigation. Given the size of the financial loss and the suspicious circumstances, they quickly escalated the case to their Financial Crimes Division. Detectives began piecing together the puzzle of Gary Tillman's, or rather Nicholas Hayes's, deception. Yelena provided them with every scrap of information she had, emails, text messages, and the few photos she had of him. Investigators combed through bank records tracing the money that had disappeared from Yelena's account. What they found painted a clear picture of Nicholas's fraudulent schemes. He had used multiple fake identities to open accounts and funnel stolen funds. Each transfer led to another layer of deception, with money bouncing between banks in different states to obscure the trail. But Nicholas had made mistakes. Detectives uncovered receipts from luxury stores in Miami, Florida, and surveillance footage confirmed what they suspected. Nicholas was living extravagantly off Yelena's life savings. The investigators also searched for his digital footprint. Though he had taken precautions to erase much of his online presence, they discovered an old email address linked to accounts he had used in previous scams. His arrogance had left behind just enough clues to build a case against him. Meanwhile, Yelena was grappling with the emotional and financial toll of the betrayal. She felt humiliated, ashamed that she had trusted a man who had so thoroughly deceived her. But Brielle refused to let her mother blame herself. "This isn't your fault," she told Yelena. "He's a professional con artist. You're not the first person he's hurt, and you won't be the last if we don't stop him." With help from Miami police, Charleston detectives tracked Nicholas to a luxury high-rise condo overlooking Biscayne Bay. He had been using Yelena's money to fund a lavish lifestyle, complete with designer clothes, expensive wines, and spa treatments. He had even booked a private yacht for the following weekend, confident that his scheme would never catch up with him. The arrest came early one morning just as Nicholas was stepping out onto the balcony of his rented condo. He was caught off guard as officers stormed in, presenting him with a warrant and placing him in handcuffs. His demeanor shifted from confident to panicked as he realized the evidence against him was overwhelming. Back in Charleston, news of the arrest reached Yelena and her family. While the capture of Nicholas Hayes provided some measure of relief, it couldn't undo the damage he had caused. Yelena's savings were gone, and the emotional scars of his betrayal would take much longer to heal. For the detectives, the case didn't end with Nicholas's arrest. Their investigation revealed that Yelena wasn't his only victim. Nicholas had used the same tactics on multiple women across several states, each time exploiting their trust and stealing their money. His pattern of deceit stretched back years, and his list of victims continued to grow as more women came forward. Nicholas Hayes was charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Prosecutors worked tirelessly to build a case that would ensure he couldn't harm anyone else. For Yelena, the courtroom proceedings were bittersweet. Seeing him face justice was a small comfort, but it couldn't erase the pain of what she had endured. Yelena's story is a sobering reminder of how predators exploit trust and vulnerability. While Nicholas Hayes's arrest marked the end of his schemes, the scars he left behind serve as a cautionary tale. It's a story of heartbreak, resilience, and the importance of vigilance in a world where not everyone is who they claim to be. For Yelena Hart, the betrayal by Nicholas Hayes wasn't just a financial loss. It was an attack on her very sense of self. This was a woman who had built her life on kindness and trust, a woman who had spent decades working as a seamstress in Charleston, South Carolina, earning the respect and admiration of her community. To have all of that undone by one man's manipulation left scars deeper than money could measure. The weeks following Nicholas's arrest were difficult for Yelena. While there was some relief in knowing that he was in police custody and no longer able to prey on others, the emotional weight of the ordeal was overwhelming. She replayed the events in her mind endlessly, questioning how she had missed the signs. How had she allowed herself to fall for his lies? Her self-doubt was compounded by the harsh reality of her financial situation. With her savings wiped out and her pension tied up in the fraudulent investments Nicholas had persuaded her to make, Yelena was left struggling to cover basic expenses. Her once comfortable life became a constant juggling act. Brielle and Caleb stepped in to support her as much as they could, but seeing her children shoulder this burden only deepened Yelena's guilt. The emotional toll began to take a physical one. Friends and neighbors noticed that Yelena, once vibrant and full of life, seemed to age rapidly in the months after Nicholas's betrayal. She stopped attending her favorite art classes and rarely ventured out to her beloved garden. Her laughter, once a common sound among those who knew her, was replaced by silence and a distant expression that spoke of unrelenting pain. 3 months after Nicholas's arrest, Yelena suffered a sudden and fatal stroke. Her family was devastated. Brielle, who had tried so hard to protect her mother, blamed herself for not being able to stop Nicholas sooner. Caleb, who had always admired his mother's resilience, struggled to come to terms with how deeply the betrayal had affected her. At Yelena's funeral, the small church in Charleston was filled with friends, family, and neighbors who came to pay their respects. Many shared stories of her kindness, the way she would sew intricate patches onto children's clothes for free, how she always remembered birthdays with a handwritten card, and her unwavering presence in the lives of those she cared about. But amid the fond memories was an unspoken question. How could someone as good and trusting as Yelena have fallen victim to such cruelty? Meanwhile, Nicholas Hayes sat in a jail cell awaiting trial. Investigators continued to uncover the extent of his crimes, linking him to at least 6 other women across the southeastern United States. Each story followed the same pattern: a man who presented himself as a successful entrepreneur, charming his way into the lives of his victims before stealing their savings. At his trial, Nicholas's arrogance was on full display. He smirked as the prosecutor detailed his schemes, showing no remorse for the lives he had ruined. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Testimonies from Yelena's family and other victims painted a damning portrait of a man who viewed trust as a tool to exploit. The court sentenced Nicholas Hayes to a lengthy prison term, ensuring he would no longer be able to harm others. For Brielle and Caleb, the verdict brought a measure of justice but little comfort. The damage was already done. Their mother was gone, and no punishment could undo the heartbreak she had endured. Yelena's story raises difficult but important questions. Could her tragedy have been prevented if she had sought advice from her family before making financial decisions? Would things have turned out differently if she had been more cautious, or was Nicholas's manipulation too skillful to detect? Her case is a stark reminder of how predators like Nicholas target not just finances but emotions. They prey on loneliness, building relationships that feel genuine until it's too late. Yelena's longing for connection was deeply human, and it's a need that can leave anyone vulnerable if met with ill intent. So how can we protect ourselves and our loved ones from falling prey to such schemes? First, communication is key. Yelena's story underscores the importance of open dialogue with family and friends, especially when making major financial decisions. Sharing concerns and seeking advice from trusted people can provide a layer of protection against deceit. Second, awareness is crucial. Scammers often rely on their victims' lack of knowledge about their tactics. Recognizing the warning signs, such as vagueness about personal or professional details, pressure to make quick decisions, or reluctance to meet family, can help identify potential fraudsters before they cause harm. Finally, seeking professional advice is essential when dealing with significant financial matters. Financial advisors, attorneys, or even local community resources can provide guidance and help verify the legitimacy of investments or business proposals. Yelena's story is heartbreaking, but it's also a call to action. It reminds us to be vigilant not just for ourselves but for those we love. Her tragedy, though deeply painful, can serve as a lesson to others, highlighting the importance of caution, communication, and education in preventing similar outcomes. As we reflect on Yelena's life, let us remember her not for the betrayal she endured but for the kindness and love she shared with the world. Her legacy is a reminder of the value of trust and the responsibility we all have to protect it. Yelena Hart's story is not just a tale of heartbreak and betrayal. It is a cautionary reminder of the importance of vigilance and the role trust plays in our lives. Her journey from hope and love to devastation is one that resonates deeply, not just because of the loss she endured, but because it reveals how easily anyone can become a victim when faced with manipulation and deceit. It's a story that underscores the need for open communication with those we trust most. Yelena's tragedy could have been prevented if she had shared her doubts or sought advice from her family sooner. Her daughter, Brielle, tried to protect her, but like so many victims of fraud, Yelena believed in the sincerity of someone who ultimately exploited her vulnerability. Have you or someone you know ever experienced a betrayal like this? Have you faced a moment where trust was used against you? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story could be the warning someone else needs to avoid a similar fate. Let's use these conversations to learn from each other and create a community of awareness and support. If Yelena's story moved you or opened your eyes to the dangers of emotional and financial manipulation, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you'll help us reach more people with these important stories, shedding light on the lessons we must all learn about love, trust, and resilience. We share real-life stories like this one not just to inform, but to empower. Together we can protect ourselves and others from those who prey on vulnerability. Thank you for watching, and let's continue to honor Yelena's memory by ensuring that her story helps others stay vigilant and safe